Hello and welcome back, and that is right. Today we're kind of going to do a re-review of the Seagate Firecuda 530. It's an SSD that I talked about and compared against here on the channel many times. Now, when I first talked about this a few months ago, this drive, I got hold of one of the few units that were out there, because let's face it, availability on day one was a little thinner than some of us would have liked due to a myriad of different world-changing events. And when I did get hold of a unit, it was a 500 gig device, and with that 500 gig unit we did a barrage of tests. We've also done a bunch of PS5 stuff in the meantime, and in that video we talked a lot about what you got for your money. This is still one of the pricier drives on the market, but with a higher degree of durability behind it, higher performance, and a bunch of extra features inside. A lot of us were wondering about whether when it launched, one, it would maintain that price point, and two, would it still stand up well against, let's face it, more than 20 to 25 different high-end SSDs that have been released over the course of the last 5 to 6 months. And for the most part, I would say that is true. Now, in today's video, I'm not only going to continue talking about this SSD where we're going to retest the 1TB model, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the landscape of PCIe Gen 4x4 SSDs has changed. And with many SSDs that have arrived on the scene in that interim period, I want to re-review this SSD to see if it still stands up since my previous review, where I did refer to it as the score to beat. Now, I am going to talk about the specifications, but I'm not going to go into so much detail this time around. The reason being that, frankly, I've covered it all in that video, and it's unfair to waste your time any further to just repeat myself. But I've got two of them here. Seagate have sent these drives. Again, the previous iteration, I had to buy my own drives. It's quite nice that they've actually sent the drive this time so we can properly look at these, rip them apart a little bit more and learn about them. But we're going to look at the heatsink equipped version. There is a non-heatsink version. It's worth highlighting that prices aren't as steep as they were when this drive was first launched. They're still higher than the majority of the SSDs out there, from the likes of the WD Black to the Samsung 980 Pro and the Sabrent and stuff like that. You do very few drives since this was first revealed to us arrive with the same specifications. We're seeing a lot of SSDs arrive on the scene that have got the same controller as this model. The controller, for those that aren't aware, is the Phison E18. And that Phison controller can now be purchased on a lot of SSDs at, a noticeable 15, even 20% cheaper than this Seagate. So it's, its exclusiveness in terms of its controller is nowhere near as strong as it might have been when it was first revealed, I believe in June, July of this year, when this drive was first shown off. But it's the other things this drive arrives with that have really changed things. So, for example, the NAND that this drive arrives with. Most SSDs in the market right now arrive with a similar NAND, 3D TLC NAND from the likes of Micron or Coaxia, but they predominantly have 96 layer or maybe a pinch higher at 128 layer. The Seagate Firecuda still remains to be one of about 3 SSDs within this tier of storage that's arrived with 176 layer NAND. So that affects performance, durability, and overall support of things like 4K IOPS as well. And that's why this SSD also excels and exceeds the majority of our SSDs in the market still, even though many SSDs have been launched on the market from MSI, Gigabit, from many brands that we talked about here on the channel. Team Group have released like 3 in that time. This SSD still arrives with some of the highest IOPS ratings, which I'm sure have gone on screen. They break into the millions quite early on, as well as arriving at 4 TB very early, with a lot of brands stopping at 2 TB. The SSD still arrives with a lot of decent little hardware specs behind it. Another thing worth touching on is the fact that it has that rescue recovery service. You probably saw that logo there at the top. That means this drive arrives with 3 years of data recovery services included. So not only have you got your standard 5 years of warranty, which is fairly universal across the market, there's only a few brands giving you a little bit more than that, and some of them doing a little worse. So you've got brands like Titanium Micro. They arrive with 7 years of warranty, but you've got to register for those 2 years. And then you've got brands like Sabrent with their series of SSDs that arrive with 1 year warranty, but 5 years if you register, which I know a number of you are less keen on there. But this SSD with its custom heatsink there, and again, this isn't the Star Wars one For those that aren't aware, Seagate released, or I'm not sure if it's out yet, that's the Mandalorian Armor SSD, their sort of gamer heatsink here. But again, we have a little look there. It's a lovely little heatsink all the way around there. Again, 4 screw lock to either side. This is PS5 compatible, so it fits exactly in that M.2 upgrade slot with the cover on top. Just to give you a little bit of perspective there about what that heatsink looks like. Let's face it, I know a number of you are already wondering. And yes, we have the WD black heatsink there between the two of them. These are both 1TB models here between them. I'd say straight away the Firecuda is certainly heavier between the two of them. Again, there's a little bit of ventilation there on that WD drive heatsink all the way around. The Firecuda there takes advantage of the thermal padding all the way through, is pushing air out the back. It's a big solid heatsink mass there all the way along. Now with the SSD, you get a few extra accessories. There's not much difference between the heatsink or non-heatsink version there. So you've got information on first time setup and a few extra details on your warranty as well as that heatsink as well. Application, how to remove, maintain it, that sort of thing. Then information on your rescue recovery services. That's 3 years of forensic level data recovery, which again, depending on how you use it, the importance of that is going to differ. If it's save data you're concerned with, or live streaming, you've got those recordings, there's a good chance you're going to like having that recovery service built in. If it's caching, like read caching, you're not really going to see it. There's the weird stickers that I've honestly never understood. I get it, but personally, I know there are some people that like jazzing things up. I personally don't really use them, so I understand why they include them for some users, but I'm fairly certain the majority of users just stick those straight back in the box. And that's about it really. The SSD, as mentioned, has got the Phison controller. It's got scaled DDR4 2666 megahertz memory being utilised inside, all the way up to the 4TB model that's got 4 gig there, and obviously it scales accordingly between them. We've already mentioned the NAND, and again, loving that stuff because the NAND overall on this, it makes it one of the most endurable drives in the market right now with a 0.7 drive writes per day. I don't think that gets anywhere near the cred it should. I know a lot of gamers aren't going to do as much write activity as a number of other brands out there in the gaming world, which arrive with 0.3 drive writes per day. But that durability is about sustained life cycle. It can withstand up to 700 gig per day being written to every terabyte and still maintain optimal performance and sustainability throughout that 5-year period. That's where terabytes written and drive writes per day is utilised. It's their way of saying it will maintain that performance in that life cycle, but also bear in mind that it means that if a brand sees that you've exceeded that terabytes written before the end of those 5 years going by, the result is that they can effectively refuse your warranty. They don't have to support you. So when you're looking at a drive that has a much, much higher terabytes written rate and a much ultimately higher drive writes per day across the whole spectrum of capacity, it means that you're not going to get slightly shortchanged if you do a lot of write activity to the SSD, and therefore that exceeds the warranty years period. It also means that this drive will ultimately live longer in terms of sustained write and the effects on that durability. You don't have to be a user that's going to be doing a lot of writing. You want to know that SSD, which again is not as durable as that of traditional boring hard drives, it's faster, it's good to see. And although there are a lot of SSDs in the PCIe Gen 4x4 bracket that have 0.7 or 1 drive writes per day present, almost all of those are using either Phison E16 controllers or effectively the previous gen controllers, so they don't give you the speed. That's why you see a lot of drives with a lower drive writes per day, because they've increased the speed, but that just means it's going to wear away at that NAND quicker. This, you're getting the best of both worlds from what I'm seeing, because you're getting a high drive writes per day and higher performance than what anyone else is promising out there. In terms of IOPS, cracking into the millions, as mentioned. And ultimately, it is a much more expensive drive, but the specifications stated do seem to play out. And when we did our testing of the 500 gig drive, that we will compare against the 1TB when we do our testing just a moment in the test machine, it demonstrated quite clearly that they were living, if anything, when it came to the specifications of sequential write, they were playing it safe with the write performance exceeding it quite impressively there on our test bench. But for now, let's get this drive plugged into our test machine. Let's run through our tests. We've already reviewed this drive before. You already know I'm a fan of the drive as it is. Let's see if the 1TB lives up to things. Now, again, for those that have come to this video to learn about how this heatsink compares against the likes of the WD Black, being a PC or PS5 setting, we are going to work on that video very, very soon, and we're going to compare that performance. If I get a chance in the benchmark, I might even bring up the temp stats on this WD Black to show you how it played out. But for now, let's get this drive in the test machine for our re-review. Okay, so we've made our way onto the desktop here. We can see on Crystal Disk we've got the drive installed, and as you can see, I've not done anything with this drive yet, but already that temperature is pretty impressively low at 18°C. So again, it's going to be really interesting to see when we open up the graph at the end just how well it can maintain this level of temperature when we perform all of our tests. As you can see on the left hand side of the screen here, we have got the Seagate Firecuda official spec sheet here, and again, previous video we tested that 500 gig. Today we are on that 1TB model at 7,300 over 6,000 there, and again there are some even bigger jumps there along the way. And again, there is a heatsink and non-heatsink version already available on Seagate, so again you can have a look at those if you want, but you want to find out what the performance is, don't you? So for now, what we need to do is head over to the system manager just to let you know how things are going to change the minute we start interacting with this drive. So we're going to go into the computer management. We can see the drive has been found. We're going to list it as a GPT. After that, create a volume. We're going to go for whatever the default settings are. We're not going to muck around too much. We're not coming up with any specialized file format here. So we're going to just go ahead, 531 TB. So again, we've got that all set up there, quick format, and now the drive is ready and available. There we go. Let's have another quick look at that temperature. So we're at 20. So again, still very, very low there. And there's our 1TB 530 drive listed there. And again, if we scroll down, we can find our results from, let's see what's the date on that. That's all the way from the 9th of August. So we've got all of our tests there from back on that day that we're going to compare against later on. And again, we're going to be running through the similar test that we've always been running in the past. For some nice mainstream stuff, we're going to use Crystal Disk. Ignore just then when the screen went black. That's just Windows looking for just double checking with admin rights that I can access this. We're going to be running a 1, a 4 and a 16 gig file test. We're also going to do some mixed read-write as well on that one. On top of that, we're going to be running Atto Disk Benchmark, another old favorite. And that one, again, we're going to run 3 different file types, 256 meg, 1 gig and 4 gig. After that, we're going to be running SSD, another one that's opening there. Sorry about the black screen. And again, we're going to be running same drive, Seagate Firecuda, 1, 3 and 5 gig file testing. And finally, after that, we're going to be looking at AJA for our performance there. Now, we aren't using an external capture card here. That is still being used for the PS5 testing. And we've got some big stuff involving heatsinks and testing that was required for. So we're continuing our use with onboard screen recording with OBS. So do bear in mind, I will have to stop the OBS recording, and we'll fast forward about an hour to when all of these 12 tests and more are completed. And again, we will show afterwards how that affected things on the graph in terms of performance, how things have gone up and down throughout all of our testing. So don't worry, I'm not showing you on screen the full hour of testing because that will be super dull there for you guys. But just take my word for it, the test is going to be fine. We're going to run through and we're going to go through all of the results to see how the Firecuda 530 performed on this test machine. Let's get the specs up there. Once again, as mentioned, this is a 6-core i5 11th gen processor there with 16 gig of DDR4 memory there. It's 2666 megahertz memory and on a Windows 10 Pro equipped system there. So again, there are our specifications. That's the terms. Let's fast forward to later on when this testing is finished because again, as mentioned, we can't leave OBS running. It's just too hungry there in terms of resources. And again, that isn't just your standard. That also includes your GPU, which is really, really important with this testing. So we've got to remove that from the equation to make sure our tests are as sturdy as possible. Let's fast forward to the completion of these tests. Right, so a very quick interlude and something I wouldn't normally do on my testing. I generally let the testing complete before I interrupt things. I just wanted to quickly show you guys something midway through my testing here. Let's get the graph up. I've performed quite a lot of tests so far. Indeed, for this SSD I noticed a trend, so I wanted to interrupt my usual workflow to test a few things. First and foremost, again, I will be making a dedicated video on this heatsink and how it compares against the WD Black heatsink very, very soon. And again, we've got screen recording there re-enabled. But instead of the usual 3 test, I wanted to bench test that heatsink a little bit and also the throughput and performance. So throughout the course of the testing so far, and the clock's on screen there, you can see that very low temperature that it started on there, we have performed a lot of tests here all the way through. And at the moment, despite all of this testing, with one test file being 64 gigabytes in size, we've still not gone higher than 38. And the drop, the dissipation of that heat is very, very good indeed. If we look at the refresh, it's coming down already very, very quickly. Now, 35C is a great temperature, but for a temperature for an SSD that's just performed a 64 gig file, a 32 gig file, a 16 gig file, a 4 gig file, a 1 gig file, and a 64 meg file, that's pretty darn impressive. And yes, the performance as you go through, the sequential read gets bigger as we go down the larger capacities, with the IOPS being higher in the small capacities, but still very, very impressive as we go through, with the SSD slowly but surely breaking in. And I think the best performance all the way through, although it hit 7,000 there at the read, in the middle there, we were cracking into the 6,000 right. Again, if we go back to the specifications there, we're still under in terms of sequential read at the top end there, but I would once again argue that this isn't the most powerful test machine. I didn't expect 7,300, but I'm glad we broke into the 7,000. Maybe not quite as much as I would have liked to have seen, but we did break into it there in the 7,000 megs. Also, the sequential write IOPS are a little not quite as high as I would have liked to have seen on these file types, but the sequential read is absolutely great there. Remember, they said it would hit 800,000, and fairly consistently it has hit 860,000 quite comfortably. But the right IOPS, they're definitely lower than I would have liked to have seen. That's enough of this interlude. Let's carry on with the rest of the testing, and I'll bring you back towards the end of the testing. Okay, so our testing has completed. I know there was that brief interlude earlier on about the temperature there, but honestly, I'm just so impressed by that heatsink. I've got to say, for this 1TB, I'm mostly impressed. There's a couple of things that left me a little disappointed. I will go through that in just a moment, but I just wanted to revisit the subject of that temperature. This is the complete temperature test there of the whole thing. This is during all of our testing, so that was all of the extra barrage of AJA testing, then there was ATO disk benchmark, then AS SSD, and then at the end AJA, all the way through them. And what's really intriguing, and again I'm going to go into more detail on this in another video coming soon when we compare them in far more extensive utilization, here is the temperature on the right hand side of the screen of when I did the WD Black there. And this is the WD graph there running the same tests. Now, again, you can largely ignore the beginning a little bit because I did a few extra tests here on the Seagate, hence why we're not going to count this, but just look between them. The highest the Seagate drive got to was 42C. If you have a look at the WD there, it got as high as 60C, and again, you can kind of see the 3 legs of each of that particular spike of testing there between them during the ATO disk benchmark test. And ultimately, it is an incredible heatsink there that dissipated heat very well, but also did not allow the SSD to get very hot indeed. And again, that's why I really like those chunkier heatsinks. But I'll go into more detail on that during the heatsink comparison coming very, very soon. But that's enough about heatsink. You came here for performance, didn't you? So, first and foremost, let's get the first 3 tests up. So we're looking at the 1, 4 and 16 gigabyte test there. We're going to ignore all of the others. That was really the ones from earlier on. And if we have a look there, we can see that we didn't break the 7,000 megs there. We broke it later on, as we saw earlier on, the minute we broke into the larger capacities, but we didn't see that level of performance where we would have liked to have seen it, which is, of course, in those 4 to 16 gigs there. Now, this isn't the first time we saw this. If I make my way into my testing that I did last time, this was utilizing a 500 gig version of this drive. So, if we look on the left-hand side of the screen, the 1 gig test file versus the 1 gig equivalent here on the 500 gig model, you can see that that was indeed able to hit 7,000 megs there on the 500 gig unit. Now, a lot of that is to do with the smaller capacity NAND still being distributed over other chips. But as you can see, this test machine was not able to hit 7,000 on those earlier test files. In every other regard, the tests on the 1TB model absolutely smashed it, with write performance there significantly higher and mixed performance impressive there at 6002, which is one of the highest I've seen in all of my SSD tests. 4K read IOPS there at random, 8600 there, lovely and high, definitely comparing very well against the 500 gig. And again, if we bring up Seagate's own datasheet there, zoom in a little bit, we can see that that is what we're going for. So again, we weren't able to hit that benchmark there of sequential read, and sequential write was hit in some of the areas there in terms of the larger 4 and 16 gig for sequential write, as we'd expect. But still, it's slightly inconsistent against what we're seeing here. It's worth arguing, of course, that they were using high-end Ryzen 7 test system, so obviously they were going a great deal higher than us, but still it would have been nice to see us break the 7,000 on the crystal disk mark there more than we did. So if we come out of that one, we'll make our way into Atto disk benchmark, bring that up. Once again, we are using OBS screen recording there in the background, so if you see any blips while we're transitioning between windows, and again, these are pretty much what I would have liked to have seen from this SSD. Unlike the previous test that we saw that took advantage of Crystal Disk predominantly less realistic as a result, it has to be said. Atto gives us a much wider spread of data traffic there, and although it didn't break the 7,000, it rarely would on Atto without a particularly high powerhouse system and playing around with some of the settings there built in, but we're keeping it as default as possible. But as you can see, we didn't go for anything more than 4 queue depths. And again, in the write speed, we're sitting there and reached a high there, 547, 5,470. And in terms of read, we hit a high there of about 664, 6,640 megabytes per second. Get a little higher in some places here. And again, we've got some high performance all the way through. But for Atto, quite impressed with those stats that we're seeing there. And again, we won't compare it against the 500. Just take my word for it. It's definitely higher by quite a marked degree. Looking at them there, looking at the write especially there, which lived at 3,000 there on the 500 gig drive. So again, fairly standard performance down on the IOPS. Atto at these file sizes isn't going to give us quite what we want to see. Don't worry, we will come back down to that on AS very, very shortly. But still some nice consistent performance there. The SSD didn't get oversaturated. The memory didn't buckle underneath things. It did a very good job all the way through. Let's move over to AS SSD. So again, we've got a 5, a 3, and a 1 gigabyte file size there. That is the megabytes per second performance. Once again, AS SSD a little stricter there on the settings we utilize there. That's why you're not seeing your 5s and your 6s. And again, we can make our way over, if we choose to, make our way to the AS SSD testing of the 500 gig drive, as we can see here. Carry on, go in. So we can move away from IOPS, as you can see from the 1 gig test file there between these two. Again, markedly high performance in terms of both of them. Read is going to be a bit narrower because read is largely the same on Firecuda drives there. You can see in terms of read, it's only really a small difference there at the other end. They're all going into 7,000. But again, nice performance, exactly what I'd like to see. And again, if we move it along into the other file sizes there, we can have a look how they compare at the 3 gig level. Again, still higher, but the read was higher there. It has to be said there when we were testing the 500 gig drive. But in every other regard, it still absolutely smashed it with a much higher score overall. And then if we have a look at the 5 gig file type there, again, sequential read a little bit higher, largely due to the distribution of those larger NAND chips there throughout them. But still, nonetheless, much higher score out on here. We're testing that 1 TB file just as we might expect. If we flick over to the IOPS, let's bring that through around there, open that bad boy up and have a look, bring up our test files, and again make our way back. And again, the 1 gig IOPS, we can go through, huge difference there, much higher, particularly on the read IOPS I would add as well between the two of them. And again, seeing much better on the 1 TB as one might expect. Carrying on, having a look at the 3 gig file there, and again, big jump, although not as much of a jump in the right IOPS. It has to be said, the margins there are a little different between the two of them there. And again, we're going to the third test. And again, as we can see from the IOPS, again, A big old jump there in terms of read IOPS, and only a small difference there of a few thousand IOPS there in 4K random on the write settings. And do bear in mind, going into the settings there, you can see with regards to the specifications, when it comes to those IOPS, the difference is marginal. We weren't able to break 1 million, sadly, I've got to say, all the way through. We did hit the 800K comfortably in terms of 4K random read, but still would have been nice to crack that 1 million. It's still great performance, but I do think this is a system, I'd need a much more powerful system to really eke the most out of this drive, something we covered in greater detail when we were looking at the 500 gig test. Final thing I want to look at here is the result on AJA. So AJA, don't bother looking at the numbers at the top because they're not really applicable for this test. What we're really looking at are the graphs below. So that's what we want to look at. So let's make our way to the AJA testing there. And as you can see all the way through, it's a nice consistent through line on both of these. Again, with the performance in disk write captures being notably higher in the 1TB as we might expect. Pretty similar, there's barely anything in it in terms of maximum there on the 500 gig versus the 1TB. If you make our way on to the next capacity up, the 4 gig capacity, these on top of each other, and again, slightly higher in terms of the disk reads and significantly higher there on those writes there, just absolutely smashing it there below. And then finally, move on to the largest file, the 16 gig. And this is where I was really intrigued, because when we tested that 500 gig drive, we noticed that the actual spiking between each of them was far consistent, and it resulted in an average much lower in megabytes per second throughout the whole testing frames. But in disk write, once again, significantly higher with the 1TB as we would expect. And in terms of the disk reads, again, higher on the 1TB below than it was on the 500 gig. But it's just nice that it didn't have that unusual spike there all the way through. And as the file sizes got larger, the 1TB really proved its worth. So what's the big takeaways in today's video? Because there's a lot to take in, there's a lot to discuss. Ultimately, I still believe this SSD is still one of the best out there. Again, with all of my testing, the big takeaway I keep coming to when looking at this drive, with or without the heatsink, is that if you are running a particularly high-end system that largely dwarfs a system like my own, if you're running a system that is an 8, 10 or 12 core system, if you're running high-end GPUs, if you are running a gaming rig professionally, this SSD will be able to support you. It not only sees its best performance in those high-end systems, but it can have that sustained performance when you need it in them. But the sad truth is, if you don't have a particularly high-end system, then you may not be able to fully see and fully realize the abilities of this SSD. So do know that you're getting a drive with some serious performance, future-proofing and durability. But if you're not running a system that can take advantage of it, it might be wasted on you the tiniest bit. And don't forget that heatsink. I still can't get over how good that performance was, and also how quickly that temperature has now dipped back down. If we refresh that graph, we can see right the way back there, back at 27, this SSD it barely blinked. Most SSDs would break into the 40s, 50s, 60s very early doors, and the fact that this SSD maxed it at that point is something I don't think gets anywhere near the attention it deserves. Make a comparison case, for example, versus the Gamix with its inclusive heatsink. That's one of the best heatsinks on the market, and even that one still hit 55, whereas the Seagate Firecuda SSD there maxed at 42 at the very top end. And I think that's a big takeaway here. But this has been my re-review of the Firecuda 530 and whether it's still worth your money and your data. I think it is. I think if you're a top-end user, you cannot do better than this SSD right now. It's just everyone else slightly lower down the chain who have looked at that price tag and wondered if they're getting the most out of it. If you've not already spent that kind of money on your rig, you may not see the fruits of your labour. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, click like. If you want to learn more, click subscribe. And do take advantage of the free advice section over on NAS Compares, linked in the description. I will see you next time.